Welcome to the Secret Lab on Raffine, the Scheming Seer. We've got a wonderfully fun commander to talk about today, and we have a lot of things we need to talk about today too on this particular commander because there's so many different ways you can take it. So let's go and jump into the actual video itself. So we've got Raffine, the Scheming Seer. That's going to be white, blue, and a black, flying in ward for 1. Then whenever you attack, target attacking creature connives X, where X is the number of attacking creatures. If you don't know what that is, draw X cards, then discard X cards, put a +1 counter on that creature for each non-land card discarded this way. Now, as far as the creativity on this particular commander, this is wide open. There are so many different ways you can build this deck. You can go Flying Tribal, you can go Spirit Tribal, you can go Unblockable Tribal. That's just the creature base. You can go draw discard style effects. You can go Reanimator. Esper Control with Raffine as a there are so many different ways that you can take Raffine. Raffine is just basically what I would like to call an enabler. Now, when you do have an enabler commander, as far as the creativity goes, one thing that I would suggest is, since there are so many different ways that you can take Raffine, or so many different packages you can take on your actual commander deck, is I would make sure that you have something that is your primary focus. So have your creature base be your primary focus, and then have, maybe 75% of your actual build of Raffine is maybe Spirit Tribal. Then 25% is maybe Reanimator. If you have a little bit of Reanimator, a little bit of draw, discard, effect, enchantments, a little bit of unblockable, a little bit of this, what ends up happening is you are hitting all the things that Raffine is good at, but you're just good at a lot of little things, and the deck is not overall great in itself because it doesn't have some core concept that it's trying to achieve. So have some sort of core concept in your initial build. Doesn't mean you can't run 2 or 3 card packages here and there for different style effects, but as far as having a commander that's wide open and can support a lot of things, just make sure that you restrict yourself in some form or fashion by having something be the primary focus of your actual build. Now, as far as the support goes, it's totally up to you, but it's going to be in the middle. Raffine does care about creatures attacking to getting that ability, but you can also just use Raffine as kind of a finisher. So as far as the support card goes for a deck like this, you don't need a ton of cards in there dedicated to Raffine. Ideally, if you build this deck, your deck should be able to function without Raffine on the battlefield. You're going to have a strong core creature base, or some sort of strong draw discard element to it. Whatever that may be, you don't have to go so heavy in support cards that your deck's not going to be able to function without Raffine on the battlefield. And as far as timing goes, this is one of those commanders, you probably want to get it down pretty early and often get those connive triggers going. But really, you can wait until the board stage is right, whatever you want to do. But as far as the timing goes, you can get it down kind of whenever the board state is correct for you. And to be honest, with it being 3 mana, even if you get it down early and gets hit with a piece of spot removal, it's really not that hard to get it back out for 5 again if it goes back to the command zone. So it's not something that we're trying to get down immediately and slam it down, but it's also, if we do get that down and we don't have protection for it, it's not the end of the world, because we're going to slowly start to get incremental value for that. Now, outside of the creative support and the timing, the way this video is going to break down is that we're going to be talking about creature bases that you can run in Raffine for the first part of the video. The second part of the video will be the non-creature stuff that you can do with Raffine, whether it's Reanimator, different things along those lines. So let's go and start off with the creature base. No matter what sort of creatures you're building for your Raffine deck, it's going to start with some sort of board wipe insurance. Unbreakable Formation, Achroma's Will, Teferi's Protection. If you are heavily investing in a creature base, in having stuff on the battlefield for you, you want to have some sort of way to protect it, whether it's Teferi's Protection, Unbreakable Formation, whatever that may be. If somebody's going to go for a board wipe, you've been getting out creatures turn after turn, you want some sort of way to cheaply protect your investment, and it's definitely going to start with 3 cards like this. So even if you're going Spirit Tribal, you're going Unblockable Tribal, hey, toss these 3 cards in there because they're really going to help you out. Outside of whatever sort of creature base you decide to go for this deck, some sort of whenever a creature deals combat damage, have something happen would definitely benefit you. So there's Coastal Piracy, Reconnaissance Mission, Bite-In of Thassa. I just include these in here because these are pretty much on theme with what we're trying to do with the deck, and that's draw a lot of cards. So let's say we're building a Flying Tribal deck, we have Coastal Piracy. Whenever our flying creatures deal combat damage to a creature, to an opponent, we're going to be able to cash in a card draw. So whatever creature base you decide to end up building for a deck like this, having some sort of card that cares about whenever a creature deals combat damage, blank happens, that would also be good to include in your actual initial build. Now, moving on to the creatures that you can run in a deck. So we're going to be looking at some of the creatures that interact with +1 counters. So we have Chasm Skulker. Whenever you draw a card, put a +1 counter on it. Then whenever it dies, we're going to be able to create X blue squid creature tokens with Island Walk, where X is the number of +1 counters on it. So you can see with a card like Chasm Skulker, we get this down. We start swinging in, or we start drawing cards, we're going to be getting a few +1 counters on it. Maybe we put our Connive trigger on there, get even more +1 counters on it. Our opponent goes for spot removal, or it dies in combat damage, whatever that may be. We're going to be able to get some really nice value from that, because we're going to end up with a bunch of Island Walk tokens on the battlefield, and really just kind of keep that process going. Same thing with Phage. Whenever you draw a card, put a +1 counter on it. And with Nadir Kraken, whenever you draw a card, you may pay 1, and then we get to put a +1 counter on it and create a blue tentacle creature token. All of these creatures I'm about to show you, you don't have to run all of them in there. What I try to do is I try to categorize them into some sort of sub-theme, or, you know, these are blue creatures that care about either drawing a card and getting a +1 counter on it, so it's going to help with our game plan. Outside of the mono blue kind of draw stuff, there's in black we have some really good options. With Blackguard, whenever a creature you control with a +1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card. So let's say we start spreading out some of our Connive triggers. With Blackguard, this is a wonderful way to attack your opponent's hand and make sure they have no resources in their hand. With Shadow Cat, that's a great way to, whenever a creature you control with a +1 counter it dies, to draw a card. Like I mentioned earlier, you know, having some sort of board wipe protection, whether it's Teferi's protection or Unbreakable Formation, having some sort of way to cash in card draw in case of a board wipe is a great thing. So Shadow Cat's definitely going to give us that really nice insurance. And then with the Inkcaster, whenever a creature you control with a +1 counter on it attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this is a wonderful way to, you know, with Inkcaster, it's not going to win you the game. But if you got a bunch of creatures and you have a bunch of +1 counters on them, if you have Inkcaster down and you're slowly just kind of making a combat swing every single turn, that draining for 1 lost life and and you gain 1 life, that's going to add up over the course of the game, and that may kind of help you. You know, it may not help you take out all the players at the table, but if you can attack somebody's life total with that taxing effect, that might allow you to kind of take a player out of the game, simply just having that taxing effect. There's also cards like Simic Manipulator. It does get a little clunky if you're trying to connive and get the counters on it, but at the end of the day, hey, it's in here, let's take a look at it. You can remove 1 or more +1 counters from it, gain control of target creature with power less than or equal to the number of +1 counters on it removed this way. And with Simic Manipulator, it has the Evolve ability, so even if you're worried about trying to send it into the combat zone, get those connive triggers on it, at the end of the day, it has Evolve, so if you just get this down and you start making your land drops, your creature drops, and you start getting those +1 counters going, you still may end up with a spot to where you don't have to swing in with it, because it is a 0/1, so, you know, it's not the strongest creature card out there, but the cool thing is you just gain control of that creature. It's not as long as you control Simic Manipulator, not till the end of the turn. It's just, hey, you point your tentacle finger and say, hey, that is mine now. Sage of Hours is wonderful in a deck like this. Put all the +1 counters on it, then remove all the +1 counters from it. For each 5 counters removed this way, take an extra turn after this one. There's a lot of times where if you have Sage of Hours down and you're conniving for a bunch and you put 10 counters on Sage of Hours, it's 2 extra turns right there. And to be honest, it's really not that busted with Sage of Hours. It's not like you're running some weird combo. So hey, if you can pull that off and get those counters and get a couple extra turns out of it, go for it. Sage of Fables. Each other wizard you control enters the play with an additional +1 counter on it. That's just kind of nice added value. You know, you're building a Esper deck, so there's probably going to be some wizards in there in some form or fashion, so it's always nice to have extra +1 counter on it. But it does have the 2 mana, remove a +1 counter from a creature you control, draw a card. So that's going to be really good going into the late game if you're trying to find answers, whatever that may be. Simply just having some sort of way to interact with your +1 counters on your creatures, that's going to give you some sort of way to either get the card advantage going late into the game, or just give you something to do. And also, with cards like Elite Scale Guard, whenever a creature you control with a +1 counter on attacks, tap target creature defending player controls. You know, this is not the best effect out there, but if you have a lot of counters on your creatures, being able to tap down your opponent's creatures before you go to blocks is a wonderful way to make sure that your attacks do get in and hit the player that you're trying to hit. With Sigarda's Summons, this is an interesting card. Creatures you control with +1 counters on it have base power and toughness 4/4, have flying, and are angels. This is something that is 6 mana, but you can definitely use this as a finisher. I mean, if you've got a lot of, let's say you're building a flying tribal deck and you've got a lot of 1-drops, 2-drops, a lot of their base power is not that good. Simply being able to develop your board state and then use this as a finisher to make them full 4 angels. Hey, that's, why not? Have some fun. We're playing Commander. And also with Ritualist, this is once again, we saw the black card that gives you card draw whenever a creature with a +1 counter on it dies. With Ritualist, whenever a non-token creature you control with a counter on it dies, create a white spirit token. So you can imagine if we had Ritualists on the battlefield, we had the black card that allows us to draw a card, we get hit with the board wipe, we're going to end up with a bunch of spirit tokens, a bunch of card draw, and we're back in the game like that. So, you don't have to run all of these +1 counter creatures in here, but, running some variation of these is definitely going to help your game plan out. Keeping on theme with the kind of the combat style, we have Bondkin. Each creature you control with +1 counter is going to be First Strike. Herald the Sacred Streams is going to give us Unblockable, and then Abzan Battle Priest is going to give us Lifelink. So, whatever sort of your playstyle is, your combat, if you're a Lifelink person, you like gaining life, Battle Priest is your person, if you want to be real sneaky, Secret Streams, whatever that is, there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of modify your creature base with +1 counters with creature cards like this. Some of the other ways outside of combat that you can kind of interact with the +1 counters is stuff like Hopeful Initiate. Remove 2 +1 counters from it, destroy target artifact or enchantment. There's going to be a lot of times where you're getting a really big connive trigger onto a creature. It is nice to have that threatening creature, but you're kind of like, man, I wish I could do something else with this. Hopeful Initiate, that is going to be a wonderful option to kind of remove those counters and keep board control going. With Karlov of the Ghost Council, you can definitely put that in there, especially if you got life gain, and even if you're swinging in with Karlov to get a bunch of connive counters on it, you can still go for that 2 mana, remove 6 counters from it at instant speed, so you can swing in, get the connive trigger, get rid of whatever sort of creature you're worried about, and kind of keep that going. So having 2 mana, it is very steep to remove 6 +1 counters from Karlov, especially if you don't have dedicated life gain, but it's still nice to have in there if you want that targeted spot removal. But also, at the very end, you just have Retribution of the Ancients, where it's X, remove X +1 counters from creatures you control. Target creature gets -X until end of turn. So unless you're just running life gain, I would definitely run Retribution of the Ancients in there, because that's just going to be absolutely wonderful. You're going to have 1 black mana, remove counters, and you can really start to pick apart the board state and make sure that creatures stay off of there. Now, moving on to colorless counter matter creatures, we have Etched Oracle. So we are a 3-color commander. It's not that crazy that with us running mana rocks in here that we can get this down for 4. So at the very least, for 1 mana, we can remove those 4 counters and draw 3 cards. Now, where this gets interesting is if this enters the battlefield as a 4/4, we put a really nice connive trigger on there. That's going to be a wonderful way to have very stable card draw. It is nice to draw a high volume of cards, but if you're discarding a high volume of cards, you're kind of staying in the same boat as far as card advantage. So with Etched Oracle, simply just being able to just draw 3 straight cards, that's going to give you a little bit of a buffer on the cards that you have to discard, prioritizing what cards you want to keep versus what you want to discard. So yeah, just imagine getting down Etched Oracle and dumping a bunch of counters on it and paying that 1 mana to just draw 3 cards. Hey, sign me up. With Spin Crusher, this is not the best card out there, but this is one of my pet cards. Anytime I'm building a counter deck, I like to put it in there. It has the ability to remove a +1 counter from it. It's unblockable this turn. So, like I said, it's not the best card out there. I love it. I think the art's very cute. But also, you can use the Spin Crusher as a way to, just target a particular planeswalker in the battlefield. Maybe you're dumping some of your triggers on there. And one of the cool things about the attack step in Spin Crusher with Connive is that whenever you go to attacks, you can put those counters on there. Before you go to blockers or declare blockers, you can remove a counter and it's unblockable that turn. So even if you're swinging in with a 0/2, you dump a bunch of counters on there, remove a counter before you go to declare blockers, and you're good to go. It's unblockable, so they can't declare a blocker. So that's another way that you can, pre-combat, dump a bunch of equipment on it, whatever that may be, swing in, get the connive triggers on there, remove it, and it's unblockable before they go to blockers. With Crystalline Crawler, one of the nice things about this is it has the ability to remove a +1 counter and add 1 mana of any color. So, like I mentioned with Etched Oracle and Crawler, having some sort of way to dump a bunch of counters on a creature and get a resource in return for that. Because let's say that we've developed our board state, we have all the threats out there, we can do whatever we need to do. Having something like Etched Oracle and Crawler as a way to convert those counters into mana or card draw, that's definitely something you want to include in your creature base. You don't have to run all of them in there, but at least, have some sort of way to exchange these counters for some sort of extra value. So outside of the counter creatures that you can be doing, you can also just kind of build flying tribal in this particular deck. We have really good cards. We have Siren Storm Tamer. That's going to give you some really good protection for your other creatures. Sierra Ascended, that's just going to be a really nice early game threat. There's a lot of times where you get this down on turn 1. You got a 6/6 with lifelink and flying, and you can never turn that down for 1 mana. And then also cards like Spectral Sailor. Flash and flying, that's nice, it's just 1 blue mana, but that 4 mana draw card, there's a lot of times where if we get into the late game, we have Spectral Sailor. It is nice to be able to just pay 4 mana and draw a card. It's not the most exciting thing you'd be doing in a game of Commander, but hey, it's better than nothing. It's better than just going back to your turn with a bunch of unspent mana. So having some sort of mana dump and drawing a card, that's going to be a wonderful thing. Some of your 2 mana flyers, we have Thrumming Bird that has Proliferate whenever it deals combat damage, so that's going to allow us to kind of keep those connive triggers, keep those counters going. Baleful Strix is just a wonderful flyer, enters the battlefield, cash in a card draw. Nightville Sprite, that's going to allow you to surveil, so you can look at the top card of your library and you can put it into your graveyard if you want. So that's going to kind of keep on theme with our connive trigger. Outside of the kind of value flying threats that we do have, there's also cards like Empyrean Eagle. That's going to just be a flying tribal lord for your creature base. So other creatures you control fly and get +1/+1. So that's just, even if you're not going fully flying, just having a lot of the flying tribal aspects in there, if you have creatures with flying, that's really going to help you out. Now with Thief of Sanity, it's going to kind of hit on that. Whenever it does combat damage to a player, look at the top 3 cards. We get to exile one of them, and then when we cast one of those spells. So that's another way to kind of generate card advantage, even though we're not drawing cards. Let's say we want to target somebody at the table that's got somebody's playing a mono black deck, and we want to find some spot removal, so we can send Thief of Sanity over there. And with Vega the Watcher, this is something that we can include in our creature base, and depending on how you have your deck set up, if you have Flashback or Disturb, anything out of the graveyard, whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, draw a card. So that's another way that we can include a flying threat and at the same time get a little bit of extra value from doing things that we normally want to do in the deck. Moving on to the 4 mana for flyers, we've got Glenalindra, that's going to be countering non-creature spells. Rankle is going to give you a whole assortment of things to do. It is flying and haste. That haste is very nice. And then Linvala. So you can see where simply just including these, last few flying creatures in here, we're not really building like Goblin Tribal, we're not building Spirit Tribal, we're just building Flying Tribal. You can see how potent just a simple Flying Tribal creature base can be in a deck like that, and especially with Linvala. If you've never played with Linvala, it can shut down an opponent very quickly, especially if they're playing Aristocrats. They've got a lot of interactions that they're going for. So simply just being able to get that down for 4 mana and get a bunch of triggers on it, that's really good. Outside of the flying threats, you can also kind of build some unblockable creatures or throw some unblockable creatures in there. If you want to look into building some sort of shadow tribal deck, there's a lot of good stuff out there. We have Voidwalker, Looter, Nether Trader. I'm going to, as we kind of progress through this video, we have a lot of stuff that we're going to cover, so I'm not going to read the cards, but basically with Shadow, they can block or only be blocked by creatures with Shadow, so that's another creature base you can kind of delve into. There's also a lot of the 1-drop, kind of 2-drop within Black and Blue that are unblockable, so like Slitherblade can't be blocked, Changeling Outcast, Triton Shortstalker. These are going to be great cards for you to get the connive triggers going on, but at the same time, if you want to build some sort of Esper, kind of Voltron equipment style deck, these are going to be some of your best options because simply they just have unblockable and they're cheap. So you can get these down, get some equipment on them, and be in a really good spot. Like I mentioned earlier, we're building some Flying Tribal. You might be able to take it into Flying Tribal. You can definitely go in Spirit, some sort of Esper Spirit Tribal deck, and it's going to be a very, very strong creature base. You have Drugskull Captain, which is going to be one of the Spirit Lords. Other spirits you control get +1.5 hexproof. Same thing with Phantom and Empyrean Eagle. Once again, that's somebody, with that Eagle, it's a spirit token, so it's going to fit in with the other spirits and at the same time kind of buff up your entire board state. Some of the good kind of value spirit tokens, we've got Selfless Spirit, Kira, and Bygone Bishop. With Selfless, that's going to be some good board wipe protection. Kira's going to keep your targeted removal kind of at bay a little bit with that counter that ability. And Bygone Bishop, if you're running a lot of creatures in here and you have Bygone Bishop down, whenever you cast those creatures, you're getting a clue token. And that may not seem like that good of an effect, but in Commander, and especially if you get down Bygone Bishop early, as you start casting a lot of those creatures, just having a free clue token tag along, that is a very, very good effect, and it just really kind of keeps your hand moving. Now, outside of the actual creatures that you can go, you can also just kind of go like Esper token build. There's cards like Bitter Blossom that's going to give you some really nice repeated token effects. Thopter Spy Network, you're playing Esper, so you're probably going to have an artifact in there, so being able to get a colorless Thopter token onto the battlefield is very nice. And there's also cards like Luminarch Ascension. There's a lot of times where if you can get Luminarch down and you can get those counters going, these angel tokens get out of hand very quickly. So even if you don't build an angel army or somebody takes care of it, the ability for 2 mana to create an angel token with flying, that is very good. You can also go in kind of this Spellslinger Esper build if you want to. Monastery Mentor is going to give you some monk tokens. Talrand's going to give you some flying tokens. And then Siegemoor Witch is going to give you some nice little green, black and green pest creature tokens. So you can see where, Esper tends to be a little bit more of a control style, color pairing or color in Magic, and so having some sort of Spellslinger deck to where you're running a lot of removal, counter spells, whatever that may be. These are all wonderful ways to where you can keep your creature count low and keep your non-creature spells high, and at the same time be able to build a lot of your board state. So that's definitely an area you want to look into if you want to go for Esper Spellslinger, which I love Spellslinger. It's a lot of fun. And last but not least, kind of wrapping up the actual creature bases for a deck like this, we're going to talk about Thopter Foundry and Sword of the Meek. This is not a creature base, but it is kind of a creature base in its own. So if you don't know about this combo, and I hate to call it a combo because it's really more of like a synergy, but let's say that we have Thopter Foundry on the battlefield and we have Sword of the Meek on the battlefield. So with Thopter Foundry, we pay that 1 mana, we sacrifice Sword of the Meek. Sword of the Meek goes to the graveyard, we get a Thopter token onto the battlefield. Then, while Sword of the Meek is in the graveyard, it's like, hey, a 1/1 just came into the battlefield, let's get out of the graveyard. So it comes out of the graveyard and attaches to that newly created Thopter token. So, for every 1 colorless mana, or 1 mana in general, we can basically just keep sacrificing Sword of the Meek, have it go to the graveyard, then it reattaches to a Thopter token that just created, and you just rinse and repeat. So if we have 10 mana, that's going to be 10 Thopter tokens with Sword of the Meek on the last Thopter token made. So you can see this is not a combo that closes the game out, but you're going to end up with a really nice value. You're going to have some nice steady life gain, and at the same time you're going to have some nice steady creature creation. So I'm normally not a combo player, but this is one of my favorite combos because it is something that is easily disruptible, people can deal with it at the table, and it does not immediately end the game. So this is something, well, for the most part, if you're just kind of, trying to go for this combo on turn 5 and you're just using all your unspent mana to generate a lot of Thopters, whatever that is, this is something you may want to keep in mind to include in your actual deck, because it's a wonderful way to very cheaply and effectively get some nice consistent life gain and get creatures on the battlefield. Now, outside of the ways that we can develop a creature base for a deck like this, let's talk about the other main factor in this particular commander, and that is drawing cards. So we want to be able to get some sort of incremental value from drawing cards. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. There's also stuff like Psychosis Crawler, which is one of my favorite cards in Magic. It's equal to the number of cards in your hand, and whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. So that's one way that with the connive trigger, let's say we connive for 5, we're going to be drawing 5 cards. Psychosis Crawler doesn't care about us discarding, so that's going to be 5 damage, or excuse me, 5 life loss for each opponent. So you can see we're having Psychosis Crawler on the battlefield, and you can, just in case something happens with Psychosis Crawler, you can put the very first connive trigger on there. That way, if your hand ever gets down to 0, it's still going to stick around. But you can see we're simply just having that life loss effect for drawing a card. That can really ping the table, especially if you're getting a very nice connive trigger going. With Teferi's Ageless Insight, so if you would draw a card, except for the first one you draw on each of your draw steps, draw 2 cards instead. So that's another way to kind of amplify it. And same thing with Alhamoret's Archive. It's just going to be that really nice card draw amplification. And there's some other good cards that kind of go with the draw discard style effect. So with Quasar in the brand new set, once again, whenever you draw a card, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is going to be a targeted effect, but if you're trying to go heavy into the wheel effect, you're with a build with Raffine, having that ability to get some sort of, negative effect for your opponent when you're drawing a card, it's really nice to include that in there. There's also cards like Currency Converter. Whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard. Then for 2 mana, draw a card, then discard a card. Then for an activated ability, put a card exiled with Currency Converter into your graveyard. If it's a land card, create a treasure token. If it's a non-land card, create a rogue token. So this is kind of a nice way that you can exile those cards if you want to, and kind of use it as a way to kind of tap and untap to go for some treasure tokens or get extra creatures on the battlefield. With Psychic Corrosion, whenever you draw a card, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of their library into your graveyard. So kind of depends on what sort of playstyle you're going for with Psychic Corrosion. But you can see if you're drawing cards and you're drawing 1 card and making them discard 2 cards, hey, that's a wonderful way to really kind of mill your opponent's library out. Outside of the kind of draw effect, there's also some really nice discard effects. So with Archfiend of Ifnir, whenever you cycle or discard a card, put a -1 counter on each creature your opponents control. This is going to be a one-sided board wipe in Commander, and if you play Commander and you have a one-sided board wipe in Commander, that is one of the strongest effects that you can have. So being able to discard cards off of a Connive trigger, put a -1 counter on each creature your opponents control, hey, that is a very good card. So even no matter what sort of build you're going for with Raffine, just including Archfiend in there, that's going to be really good for you. With Containment Construct, whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard. If you do, you can play that card this turn. So that's another way you can kind of get that added effect. It will get exiled, but at least it gives you that extra bonus of, I can cast it if I need to. And then with Sir Conrad, whenever a creature card is put into the graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, deals 1 damage to each opponent. So that's another way to kind of amplify these connive triggers against your opponent. We also have cards like Faith of the Devoted. Whenever you discard a card, it's cycle or discard, but I'm just, as this video, we're primarily going to be discarding, so I'm just going to shorthand to discard. So with Faith of the Devoted, whenever we discard, we can pay 1. That's going to drain our opponent for 2 life, and we gain 2 life. Having that effect for free is always nice, but also having the 2 life for 1 mana, it's not that bad. So if you're going heavy into the draw discard game plan, Faith of the Devoted is a really nice thing to have in there. Drake Haven's going to give us a 2/2 blue Drake creature token for 1 mana off of a discard. And then with Feast of Sanity, whenever you discard a card, it's going to deal 1 damage to any target and you gain 1 life. So this is something that we can get this down and we can kind of do spot removal on the board state, or we can target that damage up top, or target a Planeswalker, any target. So that's a wonderful way to kind of deal that damage and get some really nice life gain. There's also cards like Mystic Redaction. At the beginning of your upkeep, that's going to be a really nice scry option, but whenever you discard a card, each opponent's going to mill 2 cards. So, a lot of these are pretty much kind of doing the same thing. I'm including these in here because you can run these in groups of cards, whether you want to mill the table or kind of drain the table. Bone Miser. This is a wonderful, wonderful just utility creature to begin with. So whenever you discard a creature card, you get a black zombie token. And whenever you discard a land card, you're going to add 2 black mana to your mana pool. Then whenever you discard a non-creature, non-land card, you get to draw a card. So this is a wonderful way to make sure that you're filtering some of your card draws to get either 1, 2, or 3 sort of value from it. And then just like with Ifnir, Curator of Mysteries, whenever you discard another card, you get to scry for 1. So that's always nice to include in your actual deck building. And of course, we're talking about using the Connive trigger to draw a high volume of cards and discard cards. It would not hurt to run some extra wheel effects in an Esper deck like this. So that's Tolarian Winds, Darkdeal, Windfall. Once again, if your deck is going to care about drawing cards and discarding cards, having some sort of added effect like Windfall, let's say we connive for 5. We run into Windfall, then we go for Windfall, and then we draw and discard. You can see where if we have these enchantments on the battlefield, we get the Connive trigger going, then we run into Darkdeal or Windfall and kind of keep that value looping like that. You can see where it's going to be really hard for your opponents to kind of interact with that. Now that we're talking about drawing and discarding a bunch of cards, let's go ahead and talk about Reanimator. Raffine is going to make for a wonderful Reanimator deck. This is going to allow you to draw a high volume of cards and dump a bunch of cards into the graveyard, and that is perfect for Reanimator. So if you don't know about Reanimator, the main core concept is you want to have some spells like this. We have Reanimate, that's 1 mana, put a creature onto the battlefield with lose life equal to its converted mana cost. If you're new to Magic, don't worry about that life loss. I promise you, whatever creature you get on the battlefield to reanimate, it's definitely going to be worth it. You have stuff like Unburial Rites. So let's say that this ends up going to the graveyard off of a Connive trigger. We can flash it back for less mana, for only 4 mana. And then with Dread Return, let's say we have a lot of creatures out there. If this is in our graveyard, we can simply just sacrifice 3 creatures to bring a big threat out there. So one big thing to kind of keep in mind with the Reanimator is kind of diversify the ways in which you bring creatures back. So like Reanimate's out of the hand, Unburial Rites and Dread Return are out of the graveyard, and even between Unburial Rites and Dread Return, they have 2 alternative costs. whether it's just straight flashback or sacrificing creatures, whatever it is, have different ways that you can bring creatures out of the graveyard. You also want to include cards that put stuff directly into the graveyard. Entomb, Unmarked Grave, Buried Alive. These are all wonderful ways to make sure that your Reanimator targets go into the graveyard, so that way, let's say we run into Entomb in our opening hand. So we go Entomb, we're building some sort of Reanimator flying deck, so we have a lot of our flying creatures out there. So on Entomb, on turn 1 or turn 2, we can Entomb something like Elesh Norn into the graveyard. Now, we're set. We have a Reanimator target in the graveyard. We can start getting those connive triggers going, drawing for some sort of reanimation spell, and then once we get it out there, it's going to help our board state that we've invested in. So these are great to make sure that you can discard cards into the graveyard with the connive ability, but sometimes maybe you have a Reanimator spell and you need a creature card in your graveyard and you can't get the connive going, you can't get the attacks going. It's good to have something that's going to put something directly into the graveyard. One of the other things outside of, kind of targeted bringing out of the graveyard, you want to have some sort of mass recursion out of the graveyard. And the best card in Commander for that is Living Death. So let's say that we're running wheel effects, we go for a lot of connive triggers, we're dumping a bunch of stuff, or let's just say we get hit with the board wipe, all of our creatures in the graveyard. You go for Living Death, that's going to bring all of your creatures back onto the battlefield, and you're good to go. Now it's going to be each player, so you do need to be careful with Living Death, but I promise you, if you've been conniving and you've been drawing and discarding a bunch, finding Living Death late in the game to bring all of your creatures back, that's one of the best feelings in the world. Now with Reclamation, this is kind of that same style effect. You're just going to get a little bit of extra value from reanimating something, and the same thing with Agadium's Awakening. You just want some sort of way outside of, bring back one creature. You want to have something to bring back multiple creatures at once if possible. Now, when you're playing Reanimator, you want to have something that's a very, very potent threat as soon as it enters the battlefield. So imagine, let's say that we go for Entomb on Razaketh, we bring Razaketh back with Animate Dead. So we have Razaketh on turn 3 or turn 4. That is a very imposing threat, and you're going to be getting immediate value. There is no wrong Reanimator targets that you can go for, or Reanimator threats, but you want something that, if it's out in the early game, it is very, very scary for your opponents and very, very good for you. These are just examples. You don't have to run these in here. With Razaketh, that's going to be that tutor ability. Nez, that is a very annoying effect. It's not the best Reanimator target out there, but I promise you, if you're drawing and discarding, having that discard 3 cards to be able to exile it and bring it back onto the battlefield, it makes it really hard for your opponents to do with that. So you can even use some sort of threat like Nez, where it's not going to immediately just win the game, but your opponents are going to spend resources trying to get rid of it. And then, like I mentioned with Elesh Norn, if you're building some sort of tribal deck, with Elesh Norn, you get it down, you wipe your opponent's creatures, then you get a really nice tribal effect on your side of the battlefield. Hey, that's a wonderful Reanimator target like that. Outside of Reanimator, you may also want to include some sort of way to interact with your graveyard as far as spells go. Think Twice, that's going to be flashback. Snapcaster Mage is a wonderful way to turn your entire graveyard on as far as casting stuff out of your graveyard. And Deep Analysis, like I mentioned, having that flashback option, that's always good. Lingering Soul is a wonderful option to get creatures on the battlefield. Faithful Mending is going to give you that card advantage, and same thing with Memory Deluge. Whatever it is, you don't have to go full flashback tribal, but having some sort of way to cast spells out of your graveyard, if you're playing a deck that's going to care about drawing a bunch of cards and discarding a bunch of cards, you want some sort of way to be able to cast something out of the graveyard. But that is going to be it for the actual deck itself. As you can see, there's a lot of different ways that you can build Raffine. There's a lot of different ways you can take it. You can go tribal, you can go creature bases, you can draw, discard, whatever that may be. It is very much wide open. My initial build is going to be just kind of like flying tribal, just base flying tribal, but I may end up kind of building a few different builds of it, just because it just seems like such a fun commander to kind of build. So if you have ideas that you're going for, or maybe I didn't cover in this video, hop in the comments, let me know. I like reading them, and then other people that watch this video, they may be able to get some deck ideas from your actual comments. So hop in there and let me know. But other than that, that is going to be it for the video. In fact, if you enjoyed it, hey, like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.